And our next speaker is Dr. Daniel Pipes. He is the president of the Middle East Forum, which he founded in 1994 to promote American interests in the never-ending debates over Middle East policy. He's one of the world's foremost analysts on the Middle East and Muslim history, and he's been far ahead of the curve in diagnosing policy problems, particularly in identifying the threat of radical Islam, long before 9/11. The Washington Post has called him perhaps the most prominent U.S. scholar on radical Islam. The Boston Globe concluded that if Pipes' admonitions had been heeded, there might never have been a 9/11. And those are strong words. He's a graduate of Harvard University, seems to be something very common here, with both a BA and PhD in history, and he's been recognized as one of Harvard's 100 most influential living graduates. He's taught at Harvard, Princeton, Chicago, the U.S. Naval War College, and Pepperdine University. He's worked at the State and Defense Departments, held 2 presidential appointed positions, testified before Congress, and worked for 5 presidential campaigns. Daniel's a prize-winning columnist, formerly for the New York Times Syndicate, and now writing independently. He's also written 12 books, and his writings have been translated into 35 languages. His website, danielpipes.org, is among the most accessed sources of specialized information on the Middle East and Muslim history. He has a stellar record of anticipating Middle East crises. For example, in 1993, within days of the signing of the Oslo Peace Accord, he wrote, Arafat has merely adopted a flexible approach to fit circumstances, saying whatever needed to be said to survive. The PLO has not had a change of heart, merely a change of policy, enabling it to stay in business until Israel falters and when it can deal a death blow. In 1995, he wrote about radical Islam. Unnoticed by most Westerners, war has been unilaterally declared on Europe and the United States. Al-Qaeda invited him by name in a September 2006 video to repent and enter into the light of Islam. He declined, saying, and he said, I'm faithful to my own religion, to my own country, and to my civilization. And thank you for being such a faithful exemplar of all those. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to turn the floor over to Daniel Pipes.
Thank you so much, Jim, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. What he didn't mention is I worked here for a summer in 1984, and what Elliot didn't mention is that the last time we did an event together was 1971. So, in reply to the question before us, President Trump's ultimate deal, is Israel-Palestinian peace possible? My answer is yes. But I would like to propose a completely different approach. I do not think that the existing approach, which goes back 30 years, of peace processing, about which you've heard quite a bit now, is going to work. It can be improved, perhaps, which I think the Trump administration is doing. It's improved version. But it ultimately will crumble because it depends on Palestinian acceptance of Israel, which has not come about and is not coming about. And therefore, that is the topic that needs to be addressed. That cannot be addressed in diplomacy. That needs to be addressed in a very different way. So I'd like to take a step back before proposing an approach. And I'll start by giving you 3 dates. Well, actually 6 dates. First 3 and then another 3. The first 3 are 1865, 1945, and 1975. The end of the Civil War, World War II, and the Vietnam War. All of those were conclusively ended wars. It ended. It was nothing more. The South never rose again, the Germans didn't rise again, and we didn't try and go back to Vietnam. Let me give you 3 other dates. 1917, 1953, and 1967. The end of, 1918. The end of the First World War, the end of the Korean War, and the end of the Six-Day War. Those were inconclusive. Any day. The Korean War could restart any day. There could be hostilities between Arabs and Israel. The difference between these 2 sets of dates is the sense of defeat. In the former, there was a sense of defeat, it was over. In the latter, there wasn't. Simply to lose a round of a war is not to have a sense of defeat. Giving up on one's war goals means being defeated. And that's what we Americans experienced in 1975. Victory, I would define as imposing one's will on the enemy. The enemy gives up. You've prevailed. When you take this and apply it to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, what one sees is that for 45 years, from 1948 to 1973, the Israelis were seeking victory. After that, since 1993, since the signing of the Oslo Accords on the White House lawn, they have not been seeking victory. They have been trying various different fancy approaches, appeasement, unilateral withdrawal, putting out brush fires, but they haven't been seeking victory. The peace process has been dominant in those years. The emphasis on diplomacy, on assuming that what Arafat said on the White House lawn in September 1993 was valid, that the Palestinians now accepted Israel. The war was over. But it wasn't, and it isn't. It continues. So what is needed is an approach that confronts this irreducible problem of Palestinian rejectionism. Palestinian rejectionism goes back a century. It means saying no to Zionism, to Jews, to Israel. No, no, no. No political contacts, no economic relations, no personal relations. No. It's fractured. It's no longer as strong as it was a century ago, but it's still there. Palestinian rejectionism is the core of the problem, and it is what needs to be confronted. And as Elliot pointed out, there's this delusion due to bad leadership, due to international support, I would add Islamic doctrine, Israeli security services mentality. There is this delusion that exists among the Palestinians that they can defeat Israel, that they can cause the Jewish state of Israel to disappear. That needs to be confronted. That is what we, as a great power, looking at this conflict, need to deal with. So what I'm suggesting is that the U.S. government should adopt a policy which encourages the Israelis to win, as in 1865, 1945, 1975, to end the conflict by winning, by causing the Palestinians to understand that the gig is up and they lost. It's over, done with. When they're really upset, they write a very strongly worded letter to the editor saying, we're unhappy. Okay. But enough with the UN resolutions, however many there are, and there are very many against Israel. Enough with building up militaries. Enough with the campus BDS. Enough. Over. It's done. I'm hoping that some president, this one or a future one, will say to his staff, diplomacy isn't working. We've been at this for decades. It's not going anywhere. Is there some other alternative? And yes, there will be another alternative, which is what we call Israel victory. And as you heard in Representative DeSantis' bio, he is co-chairman of the House Israel Victory Caucus. There are now 32 members. There are 26 members of the Knesset Israel Victory Caucus. We just began it a year ago under the auspices of Greg Roman, who's sitting here, the director of the Middle East Forum, and E.J. Kimball, who's sitting parallel on the other side, who's the head of our Israel Victory effort in Washington. We're building the political base for it, and we're building the intellectual base by giving talks like this, having studies, commissioning studies, bringing this up as an alternative to the existing paradigm. And let me emphasize that it is an approach. It is not a number of policies. We're not saying two-state or not two-state. I have my own opinions, but that's not the point. The point is that Israel needs to convince the Palestinians that it's over. The conflict has been resolved by the fact that Israel is a flourishing, powerful state. The Palestinians have a very oppressive and weak polity that isn't working. It's a long-term effort. The goal is not to change policy in the next few months, but it is, with time, to put something else on the table that fits the historical pattern. You don't end wars through negotiating. I mean, think of Vietnam. It didn't end through negotiations. It ended by the North Vietnamese army coming in and taking over. That's how wars end. Wars end when one side gives up. And we have close relations with Israel. As Representative DeSantis said, we share interests and a moral base with it. It should be the side we want to win. We should help it win. And the ironic thing is that once the Palestinians give up, then they can go on to build something good. When they give up this foul, irredentist goal of eliminating the Jewish state, then they can build their own polity, economy, society, and culture. And so in the long run, the Palestinians will actually gain even more than the Israelis. Yes, the Israelis will not be murdered on their way to the pizzeria and will not face this barrage of hostility in the United Nations and elsewhere. But they live the good life, the Israelis do. The Palestinians don't. They live under oppression, backwardness. They will be able to build once they give up this rejectionism, once they move on to something that's more constructive. So I hope you will join us in advocating for this approach with your members of Congress, intellectually. I think it offers a new paradigm that pulls us out of the mire of this endless processing that goes nowhere, that in fact is even counterproductive. I would argue to you that Palestinian-Israeli relations are worse today than they were 25 years ago when the Oslo Accords were signed. So we need something new. We need new thinking. I offer this to you as new thinking and as a way for the ultimate deal to be achieved. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Daniel. I'm going to thank you. I will open up to the floor after I ask one question. And the thing that troubles me is that in a lot of the analyses of peace prospects, there's an assumption or a presumption that the Palestinian Authority is the be-all and end-all, and I think many analyses don't take into account what I consider to be the malign hammerlock that Hamas has on exactly what kind of negotiations are going to produce, and I would say that even if you could assume that tomorrow the Palestinian Authority and Israel negotiated a perfect peace deal that satisfied all their various prerequisites, whatever those may be, that the next day Hamas could explode it with another round of rocket terrorism. And to me, it seems like peace really is impossible until the Palestinians themselves come under a more unified government. And I wonder if what either one of you would, or both of you think of this, triangular, and then now we have Islamic State moving in to challenge Hamas in Gaza. I mean, how can there be peace given all these cascading radical movements?
By my analysis, over the past century, 80% of Palestinians have been rejectionist, and 20% have accepted Israel. And the goal must be to expand the 20% to 40, 60%. So it's not nothing. Don't start at 0. Start at 20. Not bad. And that 20% has been very important over the century. And so my goal is to encourage increasing number of Palestinians to recognize that the conflict is over. I'm less focused on leaders. I'm less focused on polities such as the Hamas one and the PA. I think you want a change of heart. You want to get people to recognize that it's no longer worth their while to engage in, say, suicide attacks because it's futile. So long as you think that you were part of a movement that's going to lead to the elimination of the Jewish state, well, it's worth doing it. But if you see it as futile, you're not going to do it. So I'm looking much more at the populace than at the leadership.
I'll just say a word about the leadership. I think what you're saying is points to a real problem, which is somebody has to do that negotiation, whether it's tomorrow or 10 years from tomorrow. And the Palestinian leadership today has a declining legitimacy. This is partly because they won't hold elections, because of Hamas. I mean, that is, President Abbas was elected in 2005, the parliament was elected in 2006, and those were the last elections. And the Fatah party will not hold elections, presumably because it's not confident that it will win those elections. But that creates a situation where you have a Palestinian leadership whose democratic legitimacy has been severely undermined, and which is looking over its shoulder at Hamas, knowing that, let us suppose it signed a compromise. We know exactly what Hamas would say. Yasser Arafat wouldn't sign, you signed, you're a traitor. That's not obviously going to be a very attractive proposition for anybody in the Palestinian leadership today. So that makes the possibility that this leadership will sign such a deal much lower. I would add to that that the Palestinian people have not been prepared for the compromises that any agreement would require, so that you get Arafat backing away in 2000 and you get Abbas backing away in 2008, I think because they genuinely wonder whether, I don't know whether those numbers are right today, but they worry that in fact the majority of Palestinians would reject those compromises, which would of course be rejected by Hamas and Islamic Jihad and other groups.
Okay, and let's go at this point to the floor. We'll ask this gentleman here and then this woman.
I'm Maury Amate. Is there any Palestinian in any leadership position who has basically said, okay, we've lost, now what happens to us? And if one does, what does Israel's reply?
Yes, there are. Bassam Eid comes to mind. Khalid Abu Tuameh comes to mind. And there are plenty of others. But they are part of the 20% that has no power.
So what does it reply? What does Israel say? What happens to the Palestinians?
I'm encouraging the U.S. government to encourage the Israeli government to take those steps within legal, political, and moral bounds, which will encourage the Palestinians to change their behavior. Let me give you one example. 2 days ago, an Israeli rabbi, father of 6, was murdered in cold blood. Obviously, the Israeli government is going to try and find the murderer. But one of the Israeli leaders, Naftali Bennett, suggested that's not enough, that because this rabbi lived in what's called an illegal outpost on the West Bank, that outpost should now be legalized to say, okay, you murder someone, here is what we do in response. That's the kind of thing I'd be pointing to. That would send a signal rather rapidly that murdering fathers of 6 is not really a helpful step for the Palestinians. In fact, it is counterproductive.
James?
Yes, hello. Mariah Baston, I work at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you so much. So my question, although we're dealing with the question of whether peace is achievable, is what are the U.S.'s next step should be. And I wonder if there's a way, maybe this sounds cynical, but if there's a way for the U.S. to somewhat force both parties to finally sit and take these peace talks and process actually seriously versus nitpicking on small details, whether of importance or not on borders and so forth, would be for the U.S. to take a stronger move in either reducing or cutting the aid that it sends financially to the Palestinian Authority, which is supposed to be going to helping fund infrastructure, fund schooling and education, and yet has proven time and time again to actually help the Palestinian Authority pay off terrorists and so forth. So is that a good next step that would actually force both parties to come and seriously take the peace talks, seriously?
I sort of agree with you for the implications about 50%. That is, I do not think it is sensible for us to force the parties to come to the table if they don't want to negotiate, because it won't succeed. And there are prices to pay when we do that. One price is it's always bad for the President of the United States to fail at anything. Anything. It's bad for him, it's bad for the country. And if you have endless negotiations that don't go anywhere, it creates kind of cynicism on the part of Israelis and Palestinians about the whole question of peace. So I would not say, well, if you don't go to the table right now, we will cut this part of aid, that part of aid. But I would look at the aid program in the way that Congress is doing. I mentioned Taylor Force and on the question of UNRWA again. I think we should start rethinking not with the goal of saying, you know, our purpose here is to cut the aid really low, but rather to say, is the way we are giving aid actually helping the possibilities of long-term peace or not?
And I'm against the negotiations, so I'm 100% disagreeing with you. That's easy.
Okay, yes, this man in the back here? Sure.
My name's David Edmond, on the board of the Middle East Forum. I wonder if the speakers could forecast what they expect Palestinian leadership and Palestinian governance to look like 1 year from now and, let's say, 10 years from now.
This violates the famous line of Yogi Berra, right? Never make predictions, especially about the future. 1 year from now, it doesn't, I mean, because of President Abbas's age, Palestinians are thinking about succession issues. So that's a question. One would have to assume that he will not 10 years from now be the Palestinian president and the head of the PA, the PLO, and the Fatah party. 1 year from now, you know, the assumption would be it will look pretty much the same. I think Palestinians are trying to figure out now how changed is Washington. There is a story in the Jerusalem Post today saying that the PLO, which is officially the part that negotiates with Israel, in charge of foreign affairs, the PLO is thinking of saying, we're not going to work with the Americans anymore. There has to be an international effort at negotiation, and the Israelis have, and the Americans have killed Oslo, so it's reasonable for them to say those kinds of things. The truth is that no other country could substitute for the United States in trying to convene negotiations. Whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, the French can't do it, the British can't do it, the Russians can't do it. It's not sensible. So I think you'll hear a lot more of that rhetoric. And you know, the Palestinian ambassador in Washington was recalled, but I gather he's been sent back or is being sent back. So there'll be a lot more friction. But I would suspect that a year from now things will look very much the same.
I found it amusing and very happy that the Palestinians have decided to boycott the United States. Made my day. As for what things will look like in the future, well, should the existing paradigm be continued with the peace processing, which I call war processing, it'll look the same. It may not be Abbas, but it'll be someone who is in that same tradition of rejectionism. Harder rejectionism or softer rejectionism, but rejectionism. And we'll still have the same conditions we have today. Only if there's a complete shift will there be a prospect of something better. But at this point, that's only something to be hoped for. There are no signs of it.
Yes, just a woman right here, and then the man behind her.
I'm Darlene Jackson with the National Black Republican Council and allied at RNC. Also a member of the Heritage Foundation as well. I want to thank, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, good. I want to thank the entire panel for taking the time out of your busy schedule to bring forth this scholarly data to us audience, and we really appreciate it very much. I also want to ask a question to Dr. Pipes. You mentioned that Israel would never be accepted due to the Palestinian rejectionism. And of course, it's hard and soft. You just mentioned that. And you said go back more than 100 years, which will bring us somewhere around the 19th century or 1900s. So now we're in 2017. And my question to you is, with the bloom or the boom of social media, how does that affect the Palestinian rejectionism? Is it more harder or is it more softer?
What's the impact of social media? I would say it has led to it becoming harder. People tend to talk to their own. You are in discussion with people who share your views and whatever it might be, and therefore you tend to get more excited and stronger in your feelings. So I think as you can see in this country, left and right have become harder, more hostile to each other. I think you find the same. elsewhere. Let me point out, though, that we're talking about Palestinians. We're not talking about Arabs. We're not talking about Muslims. One of the striking things that happened that Representative DeSantis noted is the lack of response to the Jerusalem step. And what's most especially striking is that the Arab states, of which there are 22, the Arab states were quiet. I mean, yeah, they made the modest condemnation. The Saudis called it irresponsible. But they didn't want to deal with it. And there was this extraordinary New York Times piece a week ago which had the tapes of an Egyptian policeman calling up talk show hosts and saying, leave Jerusalem alone. It was remarkable. A policeman calling up talk show hosts saying, stay off this subject. It's not an Egyptian national interest for you to talk about this. And that was, I mean, we only have that one concrete incidents, but clearly across the board, they weren't talking about it. So this is not Arab-Israeli, this is Palestinian-Israeli. It's very different. And whereas there's so many more Arabs than Israelis, and so many more tanks, and so much more everything, in fact, the Palestinians are a very, very weak enemy. They have no economy and no military, to put it simply. And Israel looms very large over them. So winning a war is rather simple. Not talking about winning against Morocco or Malaysia, talking about the Palestinians alone. And what's so striking also is, in contrast to the Arab states being quiescent, is that the hotbeds of hostility were in Iran and Turkey and in Europe.
This man right here. Let's see.
I'm Frank Alzona with the Center for Free Cuba. My question is, how did the policy of President Obama toward Iran impact on the Israeli-Palestinian situation? And how is the current policy of President Trump impacting on the same?
I think the main impact of the Obama-Iran policy was, oddly enough, to produce a kind of rapprochement between Israel and many of the Sunni states, because they have a common enemy, not Obama, Iran. That common fear of Iran, of its support for terrorism, of its support for war, has led to what appear to be improved relations. I'm not even talking, I mean, one assumes there are lots of secret meetings, but you can see this in the tone of comments. Daniel just mentioned the reaction to Jerusalem. It's striking to me now, when there is a terrorist attack in Israel, the official Saudi reaction on Al Arabiya is always, we condemn this attack, we condemn all terrorism, this is unforgivable, and period. That didn't happen 10 years ago. So I think that is a oddly beneficial impact. I don't think there was much of a long-term impact on the Israeli-Palestinian situation. And if you think of it, there were 8 years of no negotiations, despite considerable efforts by the president and especially by Secretary of State Kerry in the Obama second term. Tremendous amount of time put in on this, but nothing happened. So I would say I think it just kept the process going weekly for another 8 years, but had no significant impact on it.
As a historian, I savor the ironies of history. And one of them is that the huge amount of money that we paid to the Iranian government created a rise in expectations that led to the outbreak of revolts in the last few weeks. It looks like they've been suppressed, but it was a factor that in the long term, I think, harms the Iranian regime more than helps them. Another irony is that U.S.-Israel relations, I tend to like it when U.S.-Israel relations are not so good. Because when they're really good, as for example during the Bush years, Elliot, don't listen to this, George W. Bush years, the Bush administration would make demands of Israel, such as, to be technical, leaving the Philadelphia corridor, which were dumb demands that the Israelis, because of the flourishing relations, just felt they had to do. But when there are tensions, as there were during the Obama years, then the Obama administration makes all these demands and the Israelis happily ignore them. So in general, I like tense, rather poor, not terrible, I don't want catastrophe, just poor relations.
Yeah, that's a 2-hour question and answer, but I would take exception on the detail of Philadelphia, where I would argue that Ariel Sharon, as a general, came to the conclusion that if he was going to get out of Gaza, defending what is actually a line was simply militarily nuts. So I don't think it was actually something that he did because of American pressure. I think it's something he did for military reasons, but that just, you raise it, so.
Okay, this man right here.
Thank you very much for coming. I'm Max Nonigan. I'm junior at Mount St. Joseph in Baltimore, Maryland. Yesterday, President Trump, he had a press conference with the Norwegian president, and he got a question regarding a comment a general made. He said that war is coming, and specifically, with his strategic, where he is in Norway, you would think it's with Russia. But where do you see Russia, especially making strategic movements in the Middle East in the next few years?
You want to start?
Well, I think Putin, to a surprising degree, has been able to reinsert Russia as a great power in the Middle East. And I think part of that was the Obama administration's policy in Syria, its failure to push back, and behind that, I think also was its focus on striking a nuclear deal with Iran. Everything else came second. So I think the Russia is back, and I don't think it's back to the extent that it was, say, before '73. I don't think it has much of a role to play in peace negotiations, but as a security force, I think it's back definitely in Syria, and it has a growing alliance with Iran.
I see two major vulnerabilities. One is the fact that Moscow has aligned with Tehran, and has created hostility in so many other places. And secondly, Russia is a declining power. It's demographically and economically going down. So, good luck, make hay while the sun is out. But China is the real issue, not Russia. Russia is transitory. China is going to be the problem of the future, much, much more serious.
Okay, this man right here.
Yes, maybe Dr. Pipes addressed this in passing with reference to Naftali Bennett's recommendation. But how do you get, we're talking about the population, how do you expand that 20%? And in the foreseeable future, oh, I'm sorry, my name is Louis Morano. I forgot to identify myself. In the foreseeable future, especially in terms of considering Abu Mazen's advanced age, would you anticipate any Palestinian leader, non-rejectionist, being able to survive, physically as well as politically?
My focus is, for the reasons you're implying, not on leaders, but on the populace. Reducing that 80% rejectionist element to something less than 50%, so that eventually a non-rejectionist leader could survive. But no, not now. It's a long-term project. It'll take time. It'll take step by step, one Palestinian after another, coming to the conclusion that hoping to eliminate Israel is a forlorn dream. It's just not going to happen.
Let me ask a question. Where do you get the 80-20? Because I haven't seen that.
I have it from a lot of statistics. I have a weblog entry on this going back to the 1920s, various surveys that have shown this. Be happy to send it to you. And I think if you looked up 20% Palestinians, my website, danielpipes.org, you'll see about 10 different surveys and historical researches that point to this general number.
I mean, there was what I would call a positive effort under Salam Fayyad as prime minister. That is an effort to build, I'm not quoting, but as he put it more or less, we need to build Palestine despite the occupation. Forget the occupation. That's Israel's business. Our business is to build, institution by institution, to create a government, to create an economy. It is a sort of Zionist concept. That is, the Zionist movement had no way of knowing would there be a Jewish state in 1918 after the war, or in the 30s, or in 1945, or in 1960. All they knew is build, build, build. You have to be ready if and when the day comes, which is, I think, essentially what Fayyad was saying. Now, he only won his party won 2 seats in the Palestinian legislature, and he was ultimately forced out by the Fatah party, of which he was never a member. There is impressionistic evidence. I will have to look at the data. Impressionistic evidence I have heard from a number of Palestinians that younger Palestinians are more concerned with building a future than they are with some of the old formulae, like our future can only come when Israel is destroyed, or even perhaps like our future can only come when there is an independent, sovereign Palestinian state. They're more concerned with how do I get an education? How do I get a job? How do I raise my children? Which is precisely what, in a sense, we would want. We would want people to be thinking less about politics and less about Israel and more about their own society. But I think, that's the right question. I'd say one thing is for sure, that percentage, if it is 20%, cannot expand if a lot of money is being given to the people whose life's work it is to make sure it can't expand. Right. For example, by paying you a large amount of money if you try to kill Israelis. That should be obvious. And it can't expand if we continue the UNRWA model, in which what we're telling you is, no, no, no. Despite the fact that you were born in, let us say, Jordan or Lebanon 10 years ago, you're still a Palestinian refugee with the thought of, quote, going back, close quote. So we are by directing money in American money, American taxpayers' money, to those institutions, practices, expenditures, hurting very much the cause of expanding the 20% to 80%.
For anyone interested, the title of the blog is How Many Arabs and Muslims Accept Israel? I began it in 2003 and been following it for 15 years now.
See, I think we have time for one more question. Oh, this man in the back here.
Thank you very much. My name is Yaya Fanusi with the United States of Africa 2017 Project Task Force. I was outside briefly, and somebody here asked me out there what I thought about what you're doing. I said, oh, most of what they're saying is not of interest to me. I know about that, et cetera, et cetera. I said, but Elliot Abrams made a statement which would be the future. They will either merge, they're not going to merge with Israel, but they will have to merge with Jordan. Because small states, like we know in Africa, that's what we're trying to focus on, are not viable, and very soon the Palestinians will understand that.
Okay. Okay, and if maybe at this point, if I could just ask the two of you just to sum up your comments, and if you had to, advise President Trump how to proceed on this issue, what would you say? And just to top 2 or 3 things.
Well, the president clearly, from everything we can see now, is still focused on trying to get a comprehensive agreement, what's called a final status agreement, something that eluded every president since Clinton. I think that's very unlikely. And I think it would be more useful to focus on more pragmatic ways of improving the lives of Palestinians, Palestinian politics, and the medium and long-run chances that Israelis and Palestinians and Jordanians and Egyptians, because Gaza's out there too, will be able at some point to live together in peace. Or, or to live apart in peace, which may be more realistic.
The Middle East is aflame. There are civil wars in Libya and Yemen and Syria, and arguably in Lebanon and Iraq and Afghanistan. In Turkey, there is a near civil war. Sinai has something close to a civil war. There's anarchy. There are problems all over. It is remarkable that we're still talking about a problem that is 70 or 100 years old, when there's so much going on, when there's so, I mean, think of the Syrian refugees. Half of the Syrian population of something like 22 million has been displaced internally or has become refugee outside the country. Huge numbers, far, far beyond the numbers of Palestinians, which was 600,000 back in 1949. And this is not 49, this is 2018. So, given this fact, given the Iranian rampage of aggression, given the fact that Turkey, hitherto a major ally, has become close to a rogue state, given the dramatic developments taking place in Saudi Arabia, where I think Mohammed bin Salman is undertaking a transformation, wishes to undertake a transformation as deep as that of, say, Meiji period in Japan or Ataturk period in Turkey. Given all that's going on, I would say, let's outsource the Palestinian issue to the Israelis. Let them take care of it. And let's focus on the much bigger, more dramatic and more dangerous developments that are taking place in the region.
And with that, I'd like to invite the audience to join me in thanking our speakers for a very illuminating presentation. Thank you.